The risk of further inequality is high as government continues to cut expenses. The medium-term budget policy statement released earlier this week shows decreases in spending on public schools, healthcare services, social grants and old age pensions. Among those who are watching the space quite closely, there's the belief that these are violations of the Constitution's guarantee on socioeconomic rights and freedoms. The Social Policy Initiative's Executive Director, Isabel Fry, joins me now. Welcome to the program, Isabel. It's lovely to see you as always. Just share with us your marquee concerns as somebody who's watching the space very closely that arose out of the medium-term budget policy statement.
Thanks. Well, I think many of us were quite alarmed, as you heralded, by the MTBPS announcements, particularly by the contraction of 1.7% of government spend. We know that our economy is in basic freefall. We know that unemployment is stubbornly refusing to go down. And at the heart of this is the fact that the private sector is not getting the signals that it wants in order to spend. So when government spending contracts, so does the private sector. We looked also at the allocation of government spend, and you mentioned the fact that there is a contraction in expenditure on a number of the really critical areas in which we need to see investment. So the healthcare as well as the education is not getting the increases that we need. And we've also got deficits. So education infrastructure, for instance, and I know that you've spoken about this before in previous shows, we have a huge deficit in public school infrastructure, and yet most of it is going towards just trying to build up from the floods, the ravages that were caused. So we have below need expenditure, and we're not seeing the deficits being addressed at all.
And it's one thing to identify the most vulnerable sort of sectors or areas where spending is required, and that could be universal for all citizens. But in South Africa, we have an added challenge of vulnerability or layer of vulnerability, and that is around gender. Was this a gender-responsive budget?
Absolutely not. And that's one of the things that brings huge disappointment to many gender activists, including my organization, because we've had the president come out very strongly verbally in favour of the need to look at all of our expenditure through a gendered lens. We have gender responsive budgeting, the guidelines have been set out, there have been workshops, there have been conferences, and yet we've seen absolutely no referencing to the need for gender responsive budgeting or it in real terms. So, for instance, we know that the burden of care rests on women's shoulders, so there's a direct implication there, and yet absolutely no movement is being made to recognise care work and to ensure that people who are looking after the next generation are receiving some kind of financial reward, because that's where we need to be seeing the kind of the emphasis coming forward, and it's just not.
So you would say that government then is paying lip service to this highly vulnerable band because you know, the manifestation of action that they want to take or the direction in which the policy is going lies in conflict with that.
It does, and we haven't seen anything concrete coming forward.
So, you know, we'll talk about the moves that successive finance ministers have made, but there would be an argument in response to yours that might say, you know, we are spending more on things like the school's nutrition program. It's grown. We've given some more money for school infrastructure, for example, at different points. Is that enough, these what are seen to be concessions or the direction of money into areas that do warrant it and are urgent areas of need? Is it enough, though, to ensure that actually it is a holistically caring budget?
I think one of the problems that we have is that it's as if the formula, the calculations are not being done in one coherent way. So, for instance, population growth is 1.3% per annum. Right. So expenditure allocations need to at least keep pace with that. On the other hand, we have the Constitution that puts on government the burden of progressive realisation. And so there needs to be not just keeping pace, but expanding. So when you have a contraction instead, that's pulling the carpet under all the budgets of all these departments. So what we hear, and this is the narrative where many civil society organizations are just getting so frustrated, the narrative is that there is no money. And yet from the research that we do and share, we've shown on a number of fronts where up to 10 different areas of additional expenditure could be located.
And you'd obviously put SARS at the top of that in terms of their kind of highly goal-orientated desire to recoup money for the fiscus.
Yeah, but SARS also overreached 85 billion. So 85 billion rands worth of tax was achieved, which wasn't anticipated. Now that means that the expenditure and the revenue collection sides are not talking. So education, healthcare, social grants are told that they're going to have to squeeze. In fact, the social relief of distress grant was extended. Yeah. And as the Minister of Finance said, at the cost of these other needs. So you are robbing from the poor to pay the poor. Whereas SARS is just getting in an additional 83 billion, and that's mid-year.
So it leads to an important question, Isabel, about the idea of balance. And how do you believe that government should better balance debt and resource deployment to the most vulnerable in South Africa?
So many of us were alarmed that the additional overreach by SARS was not going directly to the public good, but the first call was on reducing the debt. One of the stated aims by the Minister of Finance was to reach a primary budget surplus in February. Now, we're a developing country. We're a developing country coming out of crises. To have a primary surplus makes absolutely no sense. We're actually saying that government needs to extend and borrow more. And if you compare South Africa's debt to GDP ratio compared to other countries that claim to be working under sort of far more tighter fiscal controls, so the US, the UK, they've all got debt to GDP ratio far in excess of ours. And so we're saying that we think that the orthodoxy that the Minister of Finance and the Treasury is out of touch with our needs as a developing country.
Well, let's talk more about countries that, like, I imagine Germany and others managing this the same desire and this conundrum in a way to, debt and better resource deployment to the most vulnerable.
So what we've seen in other countries, the ones that sort of Germany and some of the European as well as the US countries, is that there has been a tight contraction of the monetary policy expansion during COVID. There have been concerns there about inflation, yet they are currently facing the crises of having to, especially Europe, to deal with the impact of the Ukrainian invasion on winter and the fuel that's coming through, as well as food. So there's a crisis globally, and we've seen that knock-on effect here in South Africa. The point is that there you've got, look at the UK, the Minister of Finance who left after a few days, maybe a few weeks. But it's as if globally the known orthodoxies are not working, and we would imagine that we should be looking at at ways of meeting our needs. We've talked before about the fact that we have no wealth tax, the inequality, and so just taking back the conversation to South Africa, something which strikes me on a day-to-day basis is we can talk about the statistics, but the dysfunctions that happen. Walking around Johannesburg, you can see growing numbers of people who are just not employed. They are not linked to the economy. Now, we would imagine almost as if there's a war situation. We are in such a deep crisis. We would want to have crisis reducing budgets, not as if we're going ahead as usual.
So in order to accomplish that, what needs to change, in the way that policymakers make the allocations or rely on particular types of intelligence to inform how the money is spent?
So one of the things that we've been saying for a couple of years now is that the macroeconomic framework needs to change. So our macroeconomic framework targets debt reduction and inflation. We need to be looking instead at targeting GDP growth of 6%, as well as employment creation, and government then coming in to spend in ways that makes good the shortfall between our current a growth of 1.9%, and that's 6%. The calculations that we've done with economist Duma Klubule shows that if you do that, you would have a positive growth going up to 4.5% in the next 3 years. And the two stimuli that we would talk about, you would not be surprised. The first is the basic income grant, which would crowd in spending. And the second, in the next 3 to 6 years, would be a public employment stimulus, because we do need to get people working. We need to get people eating, we need to get people working, and both of those would get people operating as economic agents, which we need. You cannot have a functional economy when more than when 60% of the population are not functioning in that. We need to have people vibrantly buying, demanding, producing, selling. And in order to do that, we've got to change the macroeconomic framework. And you cannot steal from the poor to give to the poor.
A sobering argument you make, Isabel. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us. We really appreciate it. Isabel Fry is with the Social Policy Initiative. She is Executive Director.